it's so much easier nowadays because we have multi-track recording, and you can isolate things and you can overdub things, you can tune things. Back then, in order to be an artist, back in the era of people like George Jones, in order to be an artist, you had to be able to like sing like you were singing a hit record from start to finish, all the way through every take. And the musicians had to be able to play that way too. There was no like, oh, can you punch me in on the halfway point in the solo? It's like, no, man, that's it. It all, went down to, one track, and they were all in one room with everybody was bleeding onto each other's mics with their sound. But there was something about the way that they could just go in and record a record in 2 hours. And you were saying to me a little while ago, there's this one in particular, it's a George Jones record of Hank Williams songs that they did in like 2 hours. And it helps too when you already know the material. I'm sure all of them had come up, playing in honky tonks, playing those songs. And if Tommy Jackson was playing fiddle on it, well, he played on Hank Williams records. I remember reading a thing. It's in Keith Richards' biography. He's complaining about modern recording. And he says, yeah, we made the last Stones record, and, we spent like 6 days just getting a drum sound. And it still didn't sound right. Like in 1963, they'd take one microphone and spend 5 minutes getting a drum sound, and it sounded better than what we get now. What's the deal with that? And I kind of tend to agree with that,
I saw him a lot. Any chance I could get, I'd go see him. And when I was mentioning about the time I was in Nashville, the only time I believe I saw him in the 5 months, well, it was at the Opry a few times, and I'd have backstage. I'd be backstage, and once I went up to him after the show and introduced myself, and there was a guy there with a camera, and I got my picture with him, but I didn't exchange. I think I was too nervous. But George, it was during that period too, where he was a little bit lit, but super nice. But I would just see him so many times and listen to so many records. And so whenever I'd see him, it was just like magic, he was so, one of the greatest singers ever, and of any style. And several years later, gosh, it was in 2001, I got a call to audition for this play that was about Tammy Wynette, and it was this musical. And so they were looking for somebody to play George Jones. And so I thought, darn it, I've got this record coming out in the fall on a new independent label called Dual Tone. It was a country record. And so, but I went and auditioned and kind of had fun at the audition, and then they offered me the job. And it was to, they were having a preview and work out this thing at this place called the Flat Rock Playhouse in Flat Rock, North Carolina. And I had also worked there, coincidentally. I would go to that area every summer of my life. My dad was a Presbyterian, Associate Reformed Presbyterian minister, and then worked for the church. And so they had their assembly grounds there. And then I wanted to someday have a health food store. So I approached the lady that had the snack bar at the Flat Rock Playhouse about working the next summer at her store. And she said, well, I don't need anybody there, but we could use you here at the Playhouse to cut the grass, help me in the concession stand, help the maintenance man. So I did that for 3 summers when I was in high school. So it was cool. They had the premiere of this show up there, and then it came to the Ryman. And I got to open for George a couple of times there at the Ryman during that run. We did it 2 years, and I got a message. There was a lady, Martha Detweiler, who was good friends with Tammy and knew George well. And she said, look, I want to have you over to the house and George and Nancy will come for dinner. And so I was, talking about nerves there again. And George actually was another guy I wished I could have hung out with them more, but I didn't let myself kind of let that happen,
Was this because of your inhibition?
Yes, it was because of my inhibitions. Yeah, he was super nice. So being there next to him at dinner, actually several years before that, in 1988, I think it was, when I was living in California, I finally had gotten a record deal after years and years with Epic Records, and Pete Anderson, Dwight Yoakam's producer, started using me on Dwight's records as a harmony singer, and then produced this record for me. And unfortunately, the record didn't come out. It was a very Bakersfield country style record. But they called before things went south. They said, George is doing this duet record. And so I got to do a duet with him. And so that was, I was so nervous, but it was great too. And then that got shelved for years, and then it finally came out, and he was still alive when this record came out, but it was a record of duets that hadn't been released, and Keith Richards is on there, and some Tammy stuff, and Georgette, and a bunch of folks.
And you did your vocal. Was he there?
Yeah, we were kind of did it at the same time. Not the same mic, but
what did that feel like?
It was really intimidating, but at the same time, challenging. I had pitched him a lot of things, and Billy Sherrill produced it, and he was super nice. And Billy was also portrayed in this musical. It was kind of the thing where everybody in the band played a character. And so there was this great steel player named Kevin Owens that kind of looked like Billy Sherrill. And he had never acted before, but he was great as Billy Sherrill. And so Nancy, George's wife, said, now listen, when you are pitching George songs, if he doesn't like it, he's going to start sucking on his teeth. And you're going to know. That's so I would be like, here's one, and hand him. And the other thing too is when we got in there, I had I guess CDs were out there. I had a CD, I guess, of songs to pitch him. And then they're like, where's your lyric sheets? And I was like, So I got with Billy Sherrill's secretary and, dictated these things. She typed them up. So after waiting for probably 30 minutes, they had these lyric sheets. And so the first song would go by and George was looking at it, and then after 20 or so seconds ago. And so I go, let's move on. Let me, here's another one. And so he did that to every song. But so we ended up doing this song called The Tavern Choir, which I didn't write. But he was always so nice. And that night I had dinner with him. He said, gosh, we're sorry we can't come to the show tomorrow. I know it's closing tomorrow, but we've got to leave in the morning, so we're not. And part of me was kind of relieved because I didn't want to have to portray him in front of him. But then that night, right before the intermission, somebody came up and said, I was backstage and said, did you see him? Did you see him? I said, well, who? I said, George, he's out there tonight. So they did come, but he didn't want to make me nervous. And then at his birthday, once at the Opry, they had this celebration for him. And so everybody was singing something, and he was sitting out in the audience on the front row. So I sang Who's Gonna Fill Their Shoes, and a song I wrote as a tribute to him and Graham Parsons called The King of Broken Hearts. So that was another one of those times where when you're on stage, you can either go, I'm gonna mess up, I'm sure, or else, hey, I'm just gonna do this, and you have to.
Willie Nelson had his record label, Lone Star Records. He just signed all of his friends, me and From Holtz, Billy Carroll, Billy Calorie, just Gleason Slaw, just his buddies, because what was happening is his record contract with CBS was coming up, and Polygram or Polydor was courting him, so they gave him his own label. So Willie called me up and said, I need to have an album out. Okay. I need it pretty quick. So when? Well, next Monday. So I went up that weekend and got all these demos from Tyler, and we went in up in Dallas and recorded and put a record, and they put it out. So anyhow, we did this tour. So we were playing, did this tour. So they got us a show there at Possum Holler in Nashville. It was George Jones' joint. So we go there and play. We play our set. We finish the set. We walk in, and there's Hank Jr. and Jerry Lee Lewis and George Jones. And George is just, all three of them are just drinking out of a bottle. And George is going, Dad, me put a peace bond on me. Oh, George, you got to help me. And it was just, so anyhow, we're just kind of sitting there and so anyhow, they said, let's go, let's go play. So we go, yeah, we'll back you up. But this time there's maybe 10, 15 people in the place, right? So we walk out on stage, our band, Terry Ware, Jim Hertz, and Dennis Meehan, and all of a sudden Hank Jr., Jerry Lee Lewis, and George Jones come walking out with us. All of a sudden people are going, my God, this is holy, this is, so they come up there. So Jerry Lee goes over this kind of upright piano and hits a few keys, and George kind of puts on the guitar, and Hank kind of puts on this other guitar, and all of a sudden Jerry's sitting there hitting this deal, and all of a sudden George kind of do it, and all of a sudden George goes, I don't want to do this. And Jerry goes, me neither. And they take it out and they walk off. And so they're just perfect. It's like, I don't want to do this. Back there, yeah, let's go play. Oh, gosh, yeah.
I met George through our manager, Trey Wilson. He had been working with him. There was an ill-fated entertainment complex down in South Alabama, down in Dothan. And it was the guy that was building it and putting it together on the independent label that we were signed to. He had all these great plans. It was going to be like this little country music town. He had a George Jones bed and breakfast and a Lori Morgan's country cafe and John Anderson's blacksmith shop and all this. It was great. It was a great idea. And it didn't work out. And there was some legal trouble that some people wound up in. I think it was all about gambling, but I don't know. It was fun while it lasted. But that's where we met George. And we had started to play shows with Jamie Johnson, who was a friend. And I was talking to Jamie one day and said, we should go record Yesterday's Wine. We could do it like George and Merle did it. And he said, oh, that's a great idea. And so I told Trey Wilson, and we booked the day. We went to, I think it used to be Curb Studios there. And James Stroud was like, I'll produce it. And we're like, oh, okay. Look how easy this is. And Trey said, would you want George to come? And I thought, of course we would, but that's crazy to think about, He said,
in front of George Jones.
He said he'll do it. And I thought, sure he will. And I really didn't believe he would do it until he walked through the door. And I was like, holy shit, okay. And we had already actually tracked the song. It was just one day, in there. the band, we tracked it, and Jamie and I sang it. And George came in at like 4:00. He and his wife, Nancy. And then I was blown away. I mean, I got goosebumps thinking about it. It was just like, in walks the greatest country singer that's ever lived. And they put, James Stroud he pressed play, on the playback. And Cowboy Eddie Long was there, played steel on it. And George was like, it was really loud. And like you're listening to playback in a control room. And George goes, "That's country music right there." And I thought, how fucking great is that? Because we're a rock band, but we like rootsy music, and I grew up playing country and bluegrass, so I understand. We're not just this rock band. It's like, we're going to make a country record. You know what I mean? Like if Creed decided to make a country, sorry, Creed. But it's not foreign to us, But that was such a badge there for a second. So it finishes, and he's like, "That'll work." And he goes, "I got to be honest, I thought y'all were a black gospel group." And I think it's our name, Blackberry Smoke. I don't know, maybe he was probably like, "Who am I going to?" Because he had no idea who we were. And I thought, God, I wish. I mean, but then we went in, he said, we had already done it. And James Stroud was like, "I don't know," because James had just turned 80, or George had just turned 80. And so Stroud was like, "I don't know how much he'll want to do. He may want to sing a line. Who knows, And he said, "I want to sing the whole thing with y'all." So Jamie and George and I went in and sang the whole thing again. And it was, I can't even describe it. It was just like, he didn't have to be coached. He knew what to do.
Were you guys singing in the same mic?
Same mic.
With George Jones.
With George Jones. Yeah. And it was just like that Leon Russell clip from A Poem is a Naked Person or whatever. He goes, "It's kind of hard to sing when George Jones is in the booth." That's exactly right. He sang lower than Jamie and I and higher than us. It's crazy.
So we have these weird moments in life, but you are a kid listening to George Jones records. You never think that one day you might meet them, let alone sing on the same damn microphone.
That's right. Now, my grandmother's brothers were a gospel quartet called the Swanee River Boys. They started in the 40s, and they were active up until the early to mid 70s. And I grew up around them at family get-togethers and things in Wylie, Alabama. That's where they were from. And the leader of the band was Buford Abner was his name. He lived to be 94. And Sturgill recorded a song he wrote called "Long White Line" on the Metamodern record. It's all just kind of crazy. But I told him after we had done that with George, I said, "Did you know George Jones?" He said, "Yeah, I did." They spent time in Nashville a lot and recorded with a lot of the same producers and studios. And apparently he got in a lot of trouble with that young man. Thought, okay.
Did he give you any particular
He
stories?
didn't, but I can remember some talk around even some of even though they were a gospel quartet, it was still touring, and a lot of young man kind of stuff. But I think that was it was the industry. It was the touring musicians industry. So I even talked to Charlie Leuven at one point and asked if he remembered the Swanees. And he said, "Oh, yeah. We spent time with them too." So they were all running the same little highways before the super highways, running the back roads.
Can you imagine what touring would have been like?
With the bass fiddle on top of the car, laying on each other. We have it made.
No air conditioning.
Yeah. I love the Star Day stuff. That's my favorite. I kind of subscribe to Kenny Vaughan's opinions. We talked about that, and about Billy Sherrill saying that he only ever got 80% of what George could do, but luckily for all of us, 80% of George is better than 120 of everybody else. But that stuff, I love the 70s stuff too. It's great for a different reason. But I was talking to Warren Haynes about George and Ray Charles, the way their voices deepened as they got older from cigarettes and other things too, probably, but mainly, nicotine and age, and how their voices got richer and bigger. It's like their voices sound wider, but still, man, those early recordings that's the shit. That's the kind of thing I listen to and think nobody can sing better than this. Nobody. Like any genre of music, nobody sings better than this.
Everything you're hearing on those recordings took place live on the floor.
Yeah.
Probably into one microphone sometimes.
Yeah. Or like we talked about the Salutes George Jones record that they recorded in 2 hours. What was the label? If it was it Musicor that had, Your Angel Steps Out of Heaven, and there was a song that I asked him actually if he still would sing, and he said no, it's too high, which is bullshit because he could sing that high, and it was Things Have Gone to Pieces. And anyway, that's the greatest stuff ever.
For me, George Jones quit being George Jones right about 1970. That was it. All that shit he cut after that was awful. Hotter than a $2 pistol. It's like, He Stopped Loving Her Today is a piece of garbage, if you ask me. They call it the greatest country song ever written. It's not. Not even close. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. It's a schlock record. It's the sickening strings, and George didn't like it. He didn't want to cut it. Billy Sherrill made him cut it, and he didn't like it after that. And he didn't like singing it live. It was a cartoon piece for him. It wasn't what he really wanted to do. I think the real George Jones was the guy that recorded between Starr Day and 1970. That's it. Mercury stuff and Musicor label stuff is the real shit. Not the Billy Sherrill stuff. It's good records, but that's not the real George Jones. And I don't know who produced that was Billy Sherrill. He Stopped Loving Her Today, but I hate that. I like Bobby Braddock's version, the guy that wrote it. When he plays with his piano by himself, it's like, oh, I do like this song when he does it, Yeah. He has a different angle on it,
George recorded a entire Hank Williams album.
Oh, yeah.
In 2 hours.
Yeah, really good. Most of those records he did in that era were pretty much cut in a very small amount of time. He's such a good singer. He just those Melba Montgomery duets. Oh my God, those things are amazing. We had her on the Marty Stewart show, and we pumped her for as much information about that experience in her life. I was like, how did you guys? You just sound like you're related when you sing together. She says, well, it was just the first time we sang together. It was like that. We don't know. We didn't have to work on anything. We just would go in there and sing it. Roll the tape, and we'd stand there in the same mic and sing. That's just what they did. There weren't any punches in and, fixing stuff back in those days. They just, everybody's on the session. The background singers are over in one of the vocal booths. Everything's going down live, Don't have time to do overdubs, We got to get this done in 3 hours, It was about, budgets and stuff, We can't go over, we got 3 hours. That's, per session. They didn't want to have to pay overtime, But budgets were tight, and if you sold 200,000 records, you were doing really good. I know a lady who sold 1 million records and got dropped because she only sold 1 million, and she was really good, but that was in a different era. Yeah. I love the real George Jones. That's not the real George Jones. That's a comic book version of George Jones. George Jones checked out in about 70. He never came back. He didn't give a shit. It was just going through the motions. He was a complex individual. Oh, yeah. He just flat out didn't give a shit. There's a story about him. He bought a car in the morning, and by the time he went to bed, he'd traded 5 times. You know, he had 5 different cars in one day on one, you know, that just kept trading until, you know, he went to bed. It was 5 cars later. You know, it's the kind of guy he was, you know. He liked to mow the lawn. He liked to ride on the riding mower. That was one thing he really enjoyed doing.
Oh, the George Jones story. Well, there's many. The most famous one is that Buddy was on stage with George Jones in Texas somewhere, and he suddenly became very unhappy with the way things were going. He felt like somebody was pulling a practical joke on him. He felt like somebody greased his bar so that he would purposefully drop his bar and be made to look bad. There was some just bad vibes going on with the other band members. So Buddy just quit. He literally got up, took his steel off the stage in the middle of a concert, and just split. He went down to a bar down at the corner and then started drinking. And then eventually the road manager came and found him afterwards and said, "Would you mind please packing up my steel and throwing it on the bus and taking it to Nashville? I'll make my way back." But he quit George Jones. Months go by. This is somewhere around 61, 62. Several months go by. Buddy is now on the road with Ray Price and playing with the Cherokee Cowboys, and had heard that George and the band were over at a Ramada Inn over on the far side of town. And I actually pulled a quote about this out of some of Buddy's emails. Buddy and somebody else from Ray Price's band walked into the room where George Jones was with some of the band members, and George had been drinking and was intoxicated, and he looked up at Buddy and said, "You're fired." And so as Buddy had written to me in an email, he said, he was talking about his autobiography notes that he had given me. He said, "They should have the Jones period along with his firing me at the Ramada Inn when I didn't work for him." Another taste of Buddy's sense of humor. So, yeah, George somehow didn't put together. He just saw Buddy. His temper just flared, and he just said, "You're fired." But, of course, Buddy was working with Ray Price at the time. So,
what do we know about Buddy's earlier involvement with George Jones?
That's actually interesting. We don't know that much. I make a big deal about that in this particular chapter, that the Jones period is the one that's the hardest for historians to even get a grasp on, because it's the kind of thing where Buddy drifted in and out of George's band whenever he needed to work. You know, whenever his billfold dictated that he needed to go on the road to make some money. If Ray Price was off for 6 months, people are going to call Buddy Emmons to go on tour, right? So I think this is what happened. Ray would be off for a while. Also, there was that period when Ray got into more of a string kind of a good times kind of a period, you know, more countrypolitan and less country, and so that Buddy wasn't so pleased about that. Although they remained close friends to the very end, and they worked together many days after Buddy left the Cherokee Cowboys. I think that the George Jones period, unfortunately, is just one of those where there just aren't a lot of references. Well, what's really cool is that this box set came out of that period between 57 and 61 or so. I'd have to get the exact name for you, but the Bear family put out this box set. Historians, even at the Country Music Hall of Fame, were like so eager for this to come out, because the Bear family is known for just doing fantastic research. And some of the things that we learned, I feel this feels really pretentious. Some of the things that I and some of my friends at the Hall of Fame learned was that we didn't really know for sure that Buddy Emmons had played on Color of the Blues, the original version of Color of the Blues by George Jones, which is one of my favorite tracks, but that's Buddy on that song. And here it is. This box comes with this gigantic book with every session annotated with the exact date, who's playing on it, where it was recorded, it is just like this gold mine, So a lot of my chapter about George Jones hangs upon the fact that this album came out about 2017 or so. It's a really good record. It's pretty intense to hear. When Buddy's playing with George, it's often like a snapshot of a live gig. If you listen to Nothing Can Stop My Lovin' You, some of these tracks, they just sound like they were recorded in a honky-tonk. That's what's exciting about them, is that they're probably done over here at the Quonset Hut across the street where we are now. We're at Sound Stage Studios here in Ronnie Millsap's studio, and before that, Roy Orbison owned this studio. This is a really cool room. I'm sure Buddy did a ton of sessions in here, no question. And across the street is the Quonset Hut. I'm pretty certain that's where these sessions took place.
I interviewed Lou Bradley over there, and he talked about recording George Jones.
Wow.
He mentioned a Hank Williams tunes that he recorded in 2 hours, the entire album live on the floor, and just the way things were done.
You know what? I'll have a confession to make. This is just my little thing, but whenever I come down to Music Row, especially if I'm coming to Soundstage where I work often now, I intentionally drive down the alleyway behind the Quonset Hut at 10 miles an hour, and I imagine Patsy Cline walking across the alleyway to go sing. I imagine Loretta Lynn. I imagine George Jones. I imagine Ray Price coming across to go do Crazy Arms, which was done in the Quonset Hut in '56. Marty Robbins, on and on. All of these artists, and not only that, but the players, all the A-Team, all the players, and including Buddy. Buddy probably was not a member of the A-Team so much, didn't work as much as Pete Drake and others, but Buddy did a ton of sessions in there, and I know his first session with Ray Price was done in there, and it's just, I just get, to me, that's ground zero for Nashville, not Lower Broadway or what else. To me, the ground zero is that Bradley recording studio. It has a plaque on the corner if you go around the front, because it was built in '55 and it was the first major studio in town. And so many tracks came out of that place, and it's still there. Thank goodness. They've managed to build all around it, but you can still, from the back, you can still see the curve of the Quonset Hut back there. So that, to me, that I get the chills when I go down that alleyway. I did it this morning. Coming over here, it's like, oh, this is so cool.
That's the way I drove in today.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Oh, I get that, man. It's just a really special place. But sorry, I don't mean to be vague about George Jones, but it's simply because we don't really know. There's just, it's sketchy. It's more like a weekend kind of a situation where, hey, can you come out this weekend and do this gig? And Buddy would say yes. There's even a live album with George Jones that Buddy played on that was recorded in Texas. That's a really, really great live recording, and you just get the feeling like they're just calling songs and they're just jamming. It's just improv on the spot, and it's just kind of coming out, but it's just so spectacular. Live at Town Hall, I think it's called, something like that. I'm bad with titles. I'm sorry, Otis. I really do.
In this age of
apologize.
I've gotten even worse. Just to have an album in front of me telling me what it's called. And
I love album notes. Didn't we live for liner notes? I remember Judy Collins' album was one of the first ones, Who Knows Where the Time Goes, that had liner notes. And so you could look on it and you could see that on Someday Soon that Stephen Stills is playing bass, that James Burton is playing guitar, and Buddy Emmons is playing pedal steel. And it's like, oh, who are these people? I want to know everything about them.
Aubrey Mayhew was a very eccentric character here in Nashville. He started a record label, him and Johnny Paycheck, called Little Darlin' in the 60s. And their attitude, they almost had this like middle finger kind of mission statement with that label to make just hard-hitting, in-your-face, hardcore country music records in an era when it was more like the Nashville sound. It was more strings and piano and smooth guitars and background vocals, a lot of the pop oriented, like Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves and Eddie Arnold and that sort of style. And their thing was just to make like hard hitting honky tonk country music. he was a songwriter too. Aubrey Mayhew. He produced the records for Paycheck and any other artists that that came through, but he also wrote a lot of the songs. And when you go and listen to some of those songs, they're bizarre. Like they're it's almost like kitschy. How over the top some of them are. Like "Pardon Me, I've Got Someone to Kill," and if you're familiar, there's a song called "The Cave" about a guy who gets lost in a cave, and then there's nuclear Armageddon happens while he's down there, and he comes, just like really over the top, wild, kind of songs. But Aubrey Mayhew, he was also a big JFK obsessed guy. Like he had all this, JFK memorabilia specifically around the whole assassination and all of that. He was a character. He passed away only just a couple of years ago. But I mean, I think Paycheck was a bit of a character too. And what they did together was really, really amazing. And they had all the best players on those records. They'd have Lloyd Green on steel, Junior Husky on bass, Billy Sanford on guitar, and Buddy Spiker on fiddles, and the cats, the real cats. And one thing that he would do that was a little different, somebody asked him once, "What, your records, your Little Darling records, they sound different than everything else cut in Nashville." And he said, "That's because I have them mastered in New York instead of in Nashville." And the engineer he sent them to would really bump up the high end and make those records. I mean, when those records come on, they cut, and if anyone out there is not familiar with Johnny Paycheck's Little Darling era work, boy, you need to check that out. If I'm going to sink, I might as well go to the bottom. His version of A11, which was actually cut in New York with George Jones' band backing him up. At the time, Paycheck played electric bass for George Jones, so that's actually Jones's band on that record. Man, there's some great stuff in there. Lovin' Machine is another one. Jukebox Charlie, where Lloyd's playing just any higher up and only dogs would be able to hear him. But, that's what they wanted to do with those records, was just be as in your face and unapologetically country and no subtlety, just like, country records that just, hit you in the face. Him and Jones and I'd say Farron Young had this thing to be able to sing in such a way where they put so much, such a wide range of emotion into every word, where they almost didn't need to sing words and you could tell what they're singing about. There was just so much, I don't want to say it was over the top, but it was, it was not nuance oriented. It was very dramatic. There's that record too that Jones and Paycheck did where they did just duets of 50s rock and roll songs. You ever heard that one? And it's funny because it's almost hard to tell which one is which. It sounds like a badly comped vocal of one person, where the lines intersect, and it's it almost sounds like it's one person singing, but there's slight differences. But that's the age old argument, because Paycheck played bass for Jones for a number of years, is who influenced who, because, Jones didn't sing the same coming out of that partnership that he sang before. I mean, he definitely sounded like George Jones before that, but there were details in the way that he sang that took shape while him and Paycheck worked together. And it makes you wonder who influenced who. There's probably a little bit of both, probably some cross-pollination. That happens when you sing on one microphone with somebody.
Hey friends, I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee, paying my respects to George Jones. This is his final resting place. It's George Jones's grave. It's a very, very impressive stone. As far as country stars tombstones go, Hank Williams might have the only one that's quite as big that I've visited, at least. But it's a beautiful day here in Nashville, a little bit of breeze, and there's some noise in the background from construction, and I apologize if you can hear that. But there are quite a few really interesting people buried in this graveyard. I used to come here and get some coffee and just go for walks. I've been here 15, 20 times over the years when I lived in Nashville. There's Tammy Wynette's buried here. Jerry Reed is buried here. Dobie Gray. There's quite a few really interesting, amazing folks. And right here in this spot, I believe this is called the Garden of the Grand Tour. And there's a fence put up around it now. It's a little area, a little smaller than a football field. That there wasn't a fence the last time I was here a few years ago. The rumor that I have always heard, there's a lot of empty space right here near George Jones's grave. The rumor that I've always heard, and I don't know if it's true, so forgive me, is that George bought up a lot of spaces so that some of his friends could be buried near him. And and he wanted to help people out if they didn't have the money to bury themselves. And along with that idea, his old buddy Johnny Paycheck is buried just 25 feet from where I'm standing right now. And Johnny Paycheck, was friends with George Jones for a long, long time. They knew each other for quite a while. And so it's nice that they're close to each other now. Now, I don't know if any of these other graves I'm about to mention are related, but Billy Sherrill, the producer who produced He Stopped Loving Her Today, on a grand tour, there's so many great, great recordings that George Jones and a lot of other people did. Billy Sherrill is probably 50 yards from me right now, facing George Jones' grave. It's on the opposite end of this little courtyard. He's buried over there. I don't know if that was planned or an accident. And then the Titans, Rob Baronis, who died tragically a few years back, he's buried probably 25 feet behind this camera, from where I am now. I don't know if he was friends with George, if it had anything to do with anything. Sometimes it's a complete coincidence who you end up buried by next to. But last thing I want to share is on the day that George Jones was buried, his funeral, I was sitting in a bar that night near Music Row, and it was a lot of people, music industry people or people, musicians and such, writers, packed bar, really, really, really super loud, people talking really loud. Somebody put He Stopped Loving Her Today in the jukebox. And this is probably 5 or 6 hours after George Jones was laid to rest right here. But somebody put it in the jukebox, and it's really loud. And then one at a time, people started to realize what song was playing, and people started getting quiet. And just one after another, everyone started to shut up. And about 30 seconds into the song, it was dead silence. It's complete silence as everybody just sat there quietly and listened to George Jones sing He Stopped Loving Her Today. And everybody stopped, and when the song was over, there wasn't a song that played after it. It was just a little more silence, and then people started slowly talking again. But it wasn't planned. It wasn't, hey, everybody, let's orchestrate this moment. It was just a spontaneous moment of people who grew up listening to George Jones and loving his music and loving his body of work, that everyone decided to have a moment of silence in his honor, completely spontaneous. And it was a beautiful thing, and it stuck with me. And so I appreciate you guys coming here, watching this, and paying your respects to George Jones with me. I'm going to go over here and pay my respects to Johnny Paycheck. But if you enjoy this, like this video, tell me your favorite George Jones song down below, and subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you guys soon. Much love to you.
There was a couple of times when Buddy Lee Attractions was my agent, they put me on the opening act for George Jones a couple times. And so at this point, I think that the one you're talking about was when I opened for him at the Greek Theater in Hollywood. And it was so, what was cool about that? It was that it was raining, like just sprinkling. And it started when I was opening the show, but then when he played, because, it's an outdoor venue, me and my boyfriend at the time, James Infeld, I just remember having the umbrella and kind of hugging each other and watching George Jones in the rain. I'll never forget that. And every single song he sang was like a hit. And we both just had the chills. And so we went to his bus afterwards, and we took pictures of us. Like he got the one of me and George, and I got the one of him and George. So that's the picture you were talking about. And his wife, Nancy, was super sweet. And I think I saw him one more time backstage when I was on the Opry. We were on the Opry, Grand Ole Opry, the new one. And she ended up sending me a photograph, an autograph picture of him.
That's nice.
So, yeah, he was really nice to me. He was just a gentleman and respectful. Like, I kind of got the feeling that he thought I was a good singer and that I was okay, you know. And I just kind of felt respect coming from him. And he was very gentle and happy to see me, you know, whenever I'd come around.
One time I was out there, I'd never gone to his house, and I knew where his Fox Hollow was, but I never had, like, just showed up at Tom T. Hall's house. But one morning, I had been driving around. I went to see my buddy Harley Allen's grave, which was out that way, and I was just driving in one of those moods, you know, and I just wheeled in there and went up and knocked on the door, and Tom T. came to the door, and he said, "Hang on, I'll take you down to my, I don't know if he called it his man cave or what, but he's got a little office down by the chicken pen." And so we went down there and sat around and played songs for a couple of hours, and he smoked a cigar, and we just visited. It was a great visit, you know. I love Tom T. Hall. Great writer, and I'd listened to him all my life, you know. I saw you there at the auction. Mike Bubb told me about it. All right. Yeah. So I was blessed to be able to buy his pool table, and I've spent many hours listening to Tom T. records, shooting pool on his table, you know, and I called him up after the sale just to let him know that I'd bought his fiddle and a guitar of his, and his first instrument that he ever owned that he got when he was 8 is a lap steel that his parents bought him, and I've got that. It's really cool, and the pool table. Anyway, I called him up to tell him where all that was, if he wanted it back. I said, "If you want it back, let me know. I've got it, you know." He said, "I won't be needing that where I'm going." So he was already ready to sign off as far as all the worldly possessions go, I think, you know. Well, I was told Tom T. Hall used to have parties out at his house, and he had the pool table set up there, but he would go to bed early. And one night he goes to bed at a party and comes back the next morning, and he finds George Jones wrapped up like a burrito on the pool table, passed out, asleep on top of his pool table in a rug, floor rug. So rolled up in a rug. So I think about that once in a while, playing George Jones records too.
But I wanted to talk a little bit about George Jones. He owned a club here in Indianapolis back in 1978, and nobody ever talks about it. So I figured maybe I would. I was talking to my buddy Dale Lawrence the other day. He's from a band called the Vulgar Boatmen, my all-time favorite band from Indiana. You guys should look them up if you don't know about them. They're great. But Dale mentioned that George Jones owned a club in Indy, and I'm like, that's right, man. You know, I should look into that and find out more about it. So I spent a little bit of time going through old newspaper archives trying to find any mention of it and see what the story was. I should say beforehand, George had a place called Possum Holler in Nashville that was down on Lower Broadway. And apparently it was across the street from Ernest Tubb Records and right next to Tootsie's. And I'll be honest with you, the 12 years I lived in Nashville, I tried to avoid downtown because it was just a lot of tourists and wasn't a good scene. So I don't remember exactly what was next to Tootsie's outside of maybe Roberts, but Roberts would have been Showbud back then. And I'm thinking maybe it's Layla's Bluegrass Inn. Maybe it was in that spot. But most of downtown, or a lot of Lower Broad, was owned by Roy Acuff at the time. And he owned the building Possum Holler was in. Possum Holler, George's place, was upstairs, and the Roy Acuff Museum was downstairs. And at one point, George's Possum Holler had a toilet back up, and it came down and it went down and ruined one of the exhibits down below. And Roy Acuff was thinking, well, I can't have this. And so since he had the lease, he just told George nicely, man, I'm just going to have that empty up there and not have anything, because I don't want any more of my stuff ruined. I think the way he said it was, it wouldn't be good, George, me having turds in the Roy Acuff collection. So Roy had him move out of there, and I think George started a place in Printer's Alley. But he started reaching out, George did, opening up new places, and one of them was in Indianapolis, in Speedway, which is on the west side of Indianapolis. It's where the Indianapolis 500 is held. It's where the track is there. And very working class area. And in 1978, I can imagine what Speedway was like. It would have been, maybe that's why they chose to put a country music bar there to begin with. But I looked up, and the first mention of this I could find in the newspapers was an article. It says Possum Holler premiering in Speedway. Excuse me. It says by Cecil Redman. It says, you might say the cat is out of the bag. George Jones Possum Holler is opening on the premises of the now defunct Peppermint Tiger 2001 Disco in the Speedway Shopping Center. What could possibly go wrong? Under new ownership and management, the club will feature the whole range of country music, according to spokesman Tommy Redman. This sounds like in the Blues Brothers, where they say we play both kinds of music. They're at Bob's Country Bunker, country and western. That's what this sounds like to me. It says, the club will feature the whole range of country music. We'll have everything from country folk to country rock to contemporary country music, with artists such as, and get this lineup they're promising, Farron Young, Johnny Paycheck, Pure Prairie League, the Oak Ridge Boys, Emmylou Harris, Johnny Rodriguez, Doc Watson, Jerry Jeff Walker, Commander Cody, Waylon Jennings, Kenny Rogers, Merle Haggard, and the Charlie Daniels Band. That's a hell of a promise for a place that I think held around 400 or 500 people. That's some pretty highfalutin promises. But it says premiering acts. The premiering acts will be Ron Mabry with a 7-piece band this week and next. And I don't think I've ever met Ron Mabry, but when I look, and I don't think I'd heard of him. I feel kind of bad about that. But when I look up in these newspaper articles, he's everywhere playing around town. He's obviously a guy working his ass off playing music, and seemed like he had it going on in 1978. And also says Jeannie Seeley and Jack Green will play there. And then it goes on to say that the big grand opening will be a 2-night stand with Jerry Lee Lewis. That's a pretty good opening right there. That's pretty good. In 1978. So if this works out right, you'll be seeing the ad for opening night with Jerry Lee Lewis right here. I hope that works. But it says, come celebrate our grand opening, June 16th and June 17th, the Jerry Lee Lewis Show. Here hits, great balls of fire, a whole lot of shaking going on, 2 shows nightly. The finest in country music, 6 nights a week. Possum Holler says, it was at 5650 Crawfordsville Road. If you're in Indianapolis, or if you come through, that's they've tore down where this was, and built another ugly strip mall right there. That's what we do. And but if you look at where the Eyeglass World is in the parking lot, and I think there's a Bank of America, there's a bank right next to the Eyeglass World. I think that those two right there would have been where Possum Holler was. And anyway, when you think of playing music in, like I said earlier, Speedway in 1978, I don't know, those lineups sound amazing, and I would love to go, but man, I don't know. It would have been quite the experience to be amongst the crowd. And I found a letter to the editor here that speaks to that. And before I say what it is, there was a band called the Wright Brothers who played this place like every week. It seemed like they were a house band for a time. Really great band. And always heard of the Wright brothers, and a lot of people loved them. And I'd met one of them, Tim Wright, a couple times through my buddy Dean Metcalf. Really great guy, really talented guy. And I reached out to Dean. Remember Dean? We did the episode with, had a couple guitars. I did a couple episodes with producer of the Bob and Tom show. Love Dean. And I'm like, hey man, you think Tim, you know, will share some stories about this? He's like, I don't know. So I reached out. We'll see what happens. But the Wright brothers would play there a couple times. And to give you an idea of what this place might have been like, I remember I read a review that I'm not going to share here because there's not enough to it, from the Indianapolis Star with Zach Duncan. I'm sorry, I'm getting all over the place here. Zach Duncan was our music editor in the Indianapolis Star. He had a column called Rock Pile. Really great stuff, and I read him religiously when I was a kid. I was really into it. So when Bob Seger came through, or Dylan or whoever, he would be writing about it. And he went to opening night and wrote about it, just being, said Jerry Lee was really good, but the place was hard to breathe, you know, no airflow, smoky, and just everything you would think it might be. And it didn't sound like the greatest place if you read between the lines of his column. But this is a letter to the editor in 1978 to the Indianapolis Star. It says, on the evening of November 24th at George Jones' Possum Holler in Speedway, the Wright brothers, considered amongst the finest in the entertainment business, attempted to hold a concert. Unfortunately, among the many Wright brothers devotees attending there were a very small number of empty-headed rednecks who were permitted to destroy the performance. That's pretty damn good. That rolls right off the tongue. It's kind of poetry. It says, as the management stood idly by, these rednecks inundated these fine musicians with a sickening torrent of filth and insults. No wonder things in our society erupt into violence of inexplicable proportions when those in charge allow greed and cowardice to govern their actions. That is SGP from Columbus, Indiana. And as letters to the editors go with righteous indignation, that's pretty damn good. That's pretty damn good. And I read that about 3 times back and forth, and I sat there trying to figure out whether I would absolutely love this person or want to just dislike this person or want to stay away. And I'm not honestly sure, but I know there's no in between. There's no in between, but that's a damn good letter to the editor. And it's a nice snapshot of what the place might have been. It wasn't a listening room. And there were probably a lot of people that got drunk and came over after work. And there's also a, if you look right here, if all goes well, I'll put up a thing that shows that Fair and Young at Possum Holler in Speedway, Indiana, in person, July 15th, where national recording artists and top name entertainment perform. And down at the bottom, it says, coming soon, Joe Stampley, Asleep at the Wheel, and Johnny Rodriguez. It sounds pretty good. I don't know if those happened or not. And as I looked, there was a lot of people that were promised. I could not find any record of the Oak Ridge Boys playing this little smoky place in Speedway. Weren't the Oak Ridge Boys kind of on top of the world in 78? And, you know, Waylon was kind of on fire in 78, I think. Would he be playing a small place in Speedway, Indiana? I forget who else. I don't know if Emmylou Harris played there. There was a lot of people promised. It does sound like the sort of place Johnny Paycheck would have played, but I couldn't find any record of him being there. That doesn't mean that any of these might have all happened, and I just couldn't find them. But it appears there was a lot of promises made that I'm not sure were delivered upon. But in December of 78, there was a article, or just a little paragraph printed in the Star. It says, George Jones, the former husband of Tammy Wynette, who filed for bankruptcy last week in Nashville, is the owner of the Possum Holler nightclub on Crawfordsville Road. Jones, a country singer, has debts of $1.5 million. And about this same time, there was an article written in a newspaper in Ohio. So the owners of Possum Holler in Ohio somewhere, I can't remember where, were suing George Jones. I believe it said for $10 million because he no-showed a gig. And I'm wondering, and they said that it will do irreparable harm to their business going forward. I'm guessing since they opened up a place and called it Possum Holler with George Jones' blessing, and then he no-shows a gig there, they're thinking that's pretty bad for future business, which I think they're probably right. I don't know about $10 million, but so they were suing him. He also opened up a place across the river from St. Louis somewhere in Illinois, and there was another place in South Carolina. And it sounds like these places weren't doing that great. But in January of 1979, this is just 6 months after opening, the very last mention I could find of Possum Holler, the George Jones venue in Indianapolis or in Speedway, it said that we don't have the list. We don't know who's playing Possum Holler this week or if they're even open still. Something to the effect of they might be out of business because nobody's answering the phone. And that was the last mention. Hey, everybody. I've been reading George Jones's autobiography. It's called George Jones, I Live to Tell It All with Tom Carter. And it's really good. And the whole first half of this book is George Jones getting drunk and fighting somebody. And if it's a movie, it's pretty funny. You know, if it's Burt Reynolds punching Terry Bradshaw in the mouth in a bar, and Terry Bradshaw spits a tooth at him and smiles, and you see the empty space where that tooth once was, and then Terry Bradshaw commences to kick Burt Reynolds' ass all over that bar, that's funny, and I'll laugh along with anybody. But when it's real life, it's pretty hard to, it's just no way to live. And you could tell George Jones was on a one-way street going nowhere. The bottle was not his friend. We all have those buddies that when they drink, they just become violent and a monster. And it really seems like George Jones might have been that kind of guy. But our story will start. George Jones and Stonewall Jackson were playing a bar in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And somebody said something to somebody, and then some cowboys threw a bottle past Stonewall Jackson's head, and that pissed off George Jones, and that's where it starts in. George yells out, "Who did that? Who's the dumb son of a bitch that tried to hurt my buddy?" "I did," said someone from the darkness. The voice took a human shape that got bigger as it approached. I soon was staring into the eyes of a cowboy towering above me. I must have weighed all of 140 pounds. "You ain't got no right to be throwing bottles at my friend." I threw a punch that missed before I was clobbered with a roundhouse that knocked me out. I was later told I flipped over backward in midair. I landed face down in a puddle that was about 8 inches deep. Stonewall said he could only see the back of my head protruding from the water. He ran to me, but the cowboy and his buddies got there first. They began to kick me as I lay unconscious. The air was filled with fists and feet, and Stonewall said he feared I would drown as I lay there unaware of what was happening to me. Seeing that I was out of commission, and probably because they were tired of kicking, the cowboys turned on Stonewall. They beat him so severely that his eyes swelled shut. He couldn't open them the next day. We both took a terrible whipping, and then the drunken good old boys were gone. They probably thought they'd left me for dead. Stonewall was able to shake me awake about the time the police arrived. I went into the men's room to blot the blood and to shake off the stage suit I was still wearing from our show. It was the only one I owned, and the following day I had to buy some street clothes to wear on our next show. That fight never made any headlines, yet it could have been fatal if Stonewall hadn't got my head out of the water. That wouldn't have been much of a way to die, but my life back then wasn't much of a way to live. That's pretty heavy words. There's also a story of George Jones touring with Mel Tillis in 1959. They were somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, And George seemed to have this habit of breaking his arm. And his arm had just gotten out of a cast from something happening. He didn't say what happened earlier. But he decided he was, pissed off at Mel Tillis for some reason. And they start arguing. And George is in the front seat, and Mel Tillis is in the back seat. And George just started swinging on Mel Tillis from the front seat. And Mel Tillis managed to grab his arm and push it down against the seat so he couldn't punch him. And he was pushing as hard as he could, and he ended up breaking George's arm. And they had to go and get his hand put right back in a cast. I guess Mel Tillis used to joke that it would be easier on George Jones if he would just go ahead and get a cast with a zipper so he could put it on, back and forth. There's another story about him being in a hotel room in the Midwest with Red Sovine. Remember Red Sovine from Phantom 309 and Giddy Up Go? And they were playing cards on a day off, and George started getting drunk. And he just decided he was mad at Red Sovine for no real reason and wanted to kick his ass. And he's like, I'm going to whoop your ass, Red. And Red Sovine sounds pretty wise. He'd been around drunks a lot in his life, and he knew how to diffuse it. And he said, George, anybody can kick my ass. Why would you want to go ahead and do that if anybody could do it? And George kind of thought about it and thought, well, what good would that be? A little time goes by, and he gets pissed off at Red's fiddle player for no reason. And the fiddle player runs into the bathroom and locks the door. And George stands outside the door all day long saying, you're going to have to come out of there sooner or later, and when you do, I'm going to whoop your ass. And it said that the guy laid down on the floor and slept half the day. Everybody's mad because they might have had to go to the bathroom and they couldn't because George is standing outside there with the guy locked in. Finally, George gave up on him and went over and started punching the radiator for no reason. And that's not the smartest thing to do, a steel radiator. And he breaks his hand in a bunch of places and ends up having to have his hand in a cast for a while. And there was another story. I believe it was, I don't know what year it was. It was sometime in 60 or 62. George is playing at a place in Kansas City called the Chestnut Inn. And they would have country singers play for an hour. And then the country singer would go off the stage and a stripper would come on stage and do a striptease for an hour. And then the country singer would come back up and do another hour, and they would alternate like that. Well, George ends up hooking up with the stripper, and they go back to her place, and they're messing around. And sometime in the middle of the night, the door flies open, and in comes her husband with this big steel chair over the top of his head. And George says he was laying there naked in the bed, laying on his back, and the guy comes down and just starts wailing on him with the chair. And George puts his arm up, and it breaks his arm. He manages to get out of there with his clothes, running naked down the street holding his clothes. And he had to have his arm in a cast, and he would sing for the rest of the years, what he said, with a microphone while he had his arm in a sling while it healed up. The book goes on, and there's a story after story of George living like that. And I can't imagine being around him. It must have been a nightmare. He'd get bored on the road and start drinking. And then here comes that ugly side and him wanting to fight somebody. There was a story about him and I forget who he was with. He was with a buddy of him down by the Mexican border. And they went across into Mexico to go drinking. And they ended up in a bar. And there were a few Mexican dudes sitting at the bar. And George gets drunk, walks up to them and tries to talk to them, and they don't speak English. So George figures that's a time to tell them, that he thinks they're ugly, and would smile real big, and they didn't say anything. Obviously didn't know what he was saying. And he'd say something else terrible about them and kept going on, saying something about their mother. And finally they got the idea that George was messing with him and they weren't going to take it. And these 3 or 4 guys all pull out knives. And George and his friend go running out of the bar as these guys chase them in Mexico with knives. And they jump into a taxi cab and start yelling, "Border, border." And the taxi driver didn't speak English, but he understood border. So he started driving towards the border. and he's rolling up the windows as these guys are chasing them, stabbing into the car, and they're rolling up the windows. And when they finally stepped on it, they managed to get away from these guys, and they went across the border. And it just seemed like this kind of thing was happening all the time to George Jones on the road. It's a pretty lousy way to live. It's fun in a movie, but it's not so great as a day-to-day way to go through life. He tells a story about Lefty Frizzell that I think kind of sums up the whole drinking life. It's about Lefty Frizzell, which I love Lefty Frizzell's music, and obviously George did too, but I want to share that with you guys. At one time, Lefty had beautiful stage clothes, a new guitar, a new car, and a twin-engine airplane. Who ever heard of such prosperity for a country star in the 1950s? All of that was mysteriously taken from him, and almost overnight. The man was the Elvis of his time one day and broke the next. There was no explanation about where the money went. He was basically a good old country boy who felt betrayed, and he couldn't handle the pain. It says his spirit broke, from going from the top to the bottom, and he just started drinking and staying home and just drinking constantly. And his wife, it kind of distanced him from his wife, his isolation. He didn't want to go out into the world at all and just stayed in his house. So his wife started telling him, you need to go to church. She started going to church. And as she would try to push him towards that, it made him go even farther away where he didn't want to do that. So he goes to church, and he ends up hooking up with the women in the church and having a bunch of affairs. So church just became a way for him to meet women. And that ended up getting back to his wife, and they just went ahead and separated parts of the house, and Lefty Frizzell lived in his basement. And it says, Lefty lived in that basement with a bed and a stove and ate soup and other canned food. Can you imagine a man whose singing had touched millions having to live alone in such confinement? His drinking, which had been bad for years, grew worse. In his darkened room below the ground, the idol of millions became ill on July 19th, 1975. An ambulance was called. En route to the hospital, he suffered a massive stroke, according to medical records. He was admitted to Nashville Memorial Hospital, where doctors struggled to keep him alive. Lefty Frizzell, 47, was dead by nightfall. Again, this is George Jones talking. The last time I saw Lefty alive was in his basement. It was about 9 a.m. He was hopelessly drunk, and so was I. He drank that vodka like it was Kool-Aid. Seeing him there in that awful state suddenly made me sober. My heart became as broken as his attitude. I wanted to reach out to him, but didn't know how. Other folks who claimed to be his friends had come by. Some brought him vodka, and I wondered what kind of friends they really were. I wanted to say so much to him, but ultimately I didn't say much at all. We both knew he was on the bottom, and there was no point in talking about it out loud. That wouldn't have helped a thing. When I remember Lefty, I remember that voice, those hits, and a gentle spirit who also trusted folks who were untrustworthy. I honestly believe that helped kill him. That's George Jones talking about Lefty Frizzell. For what it's worth, if you're watching a movie and it's Burt Reynolds and he's fighting bad guys in a bar, it's pretty funny. But when it's real life, man, it's heavy. And there's a lot of real life in this book. And I got a feeling George Jones, it was probably really hard on the people that loved him and were around him. I'm guessing it was probably a real rough way to go through life. But if you have any George Jones stories, that you know that I don't, or if you've read this book, tell me what you thought about it. But go ahead and like this video, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys somewhere down the road. Much love to you.